On your world, you were married. On your world, you had a family. But destroying mine won't ever bring yours back. Don't hurt my family.
We're back with another episode of Superman and Lois, and we learned a lot about Lex Luthor and his daughter Elizabeth in this episode, and it tried to make it look like Luthor was a good father. However, in the end of the day, he is so focused on his revenge that he can't let anything go. And we'll talk all about it in this week's episode, but we also got a couple other things to talk about, as there has been some concept art released for what Jordan and Jonathan's suits will look like. Now, we're going to talk about this video, but we're going to wait till the end to do that, so if you don't want to get spoiled and want to wait till the reveal, because I ultimately got spoiled, I'll give you a warning before we get into it. But we'll do that at the end, so just stick around to the end to see that part. Now, let's jump into the episode, because the episode starts off with Luthor getting divorced from his ex-wife. And it just turns out that Luthor was never there for his family. He never did anything for them. It was always for himself. So he's always just very selfish. Even showing that he was just very neglectful to his wife. He never was with her. He was always away. And he won't even let her in. He won't be vulnerable with her. Which kind of shows you what kind of person Luthor is. He's so traumatized from his childhood that he pushes everyone away from him. She even calls him out on that by saying that he's still a mad young boy who was hurt by his mother. And we see more of that later in the episode. But this kind of just shows where Luthor is. He was never given the proper help or the proper support system to rise up as a normal human being. He had to do everything himself, which makes it so that he just has to do everything himself. He can't ever be wrong. He has to be right. And it just forces this kind of self-centeredness that's around him, which explains why he is the way he is. And one of the things I picked up right off the bat of the episode is how we had this conversation with his ex-wife. It kind of explains why he's pushing back from what his ex said. He's trying to find Elizabeth because he wants to be in his daughter's life, because he wants to prove that he can be a father. He wants to prove that he can let someone in. Because he has regrets, he's made mistakes. He realizes that to an extent, even though he won't admit it himself. So that's why he wants to see his daughter once again. And I truly believe he does love his daughter, even though his hate for Superman and his family and the revenge he wants against Lois Lane is much stronger than that. Now, his ex-wife's name is Erica, which could be a reference to Contessa Erica Alexandra del Porzena, who, in the comics, was a wife of Lex Luthor. And turns out they also had a daughter in the comics as well, named Lena Luthor. And at some point, Lena Luthor was taken over by Brainiac 13, which is interesting to see that Lex Luthor has had a daughter in the comics. He had a wife in the comics at one point. So it's interesting to see, how this storyline connects to little pieces from the comics. But as we go through the episode, we catch up with Luthor looking at the paper where it says Superman is alive. And the paper is written by Janet Olsen, which this could be a reference to Jimmy Olsen, one of Superman's best friends, or it could be a reference to Jimmy's sister, Janie Olsen. I'm thinking more on the Jimmy Olsen side of things, because Jimmy worked at the Daily Planet, but this could be a little twist where more of his family is there as well. Because they also have never introduced Jimmy Olsen into this, so maybe we'll see him this season. We had Clark Kent being classic Superman, where he wants to understand Luthor. He wants to talk to him, father to father. He wants to connect to him through his heart. Which is like a big thing with Superman in the comics, is that he doesn't want to always solve everything by beating up the bad guy. He wants to understand them, he wants to connect with them, because he's a caring person. And that just screams what it means to be this hero. He's not this big god that runs around the earth and beats everyone up. No, he reaches out and tries to connect with the people he's fighting, to understand them. But at the same time, if you're going around wrecking stuff and putting up a fight, he will beat you up and he will take you down, because Superman does not stand for bullies. It's kind of one of those two things. He doesn't want to always beat everyone up, but he will if he has to. And I love that they showed that in this episode. Now, one of the things after Clark is done talking to Lois is that Sam really had the relocation document for Elizabeth with all his stuff. I guess it makes sense that he had it with his personal items so that people couldn't find it, but it just made it so easy for Lois just to find it right there and then. And it was just kind of like, oh, this is a simple plot device. Sam isn't around anymore. Here's the paperwork. There was a couple convenience things that happened in this episode, especially with Doomsday, but we'll get to that. And I don't know how I feel about it just yet. I think I have to let it sit a little bit by the time we get to it, but the show is still doing an amazing job with the characters, and I love to see it. But as Clark does come face to face with Luthor, we have him just trying to speak to a father, trying to get him to stop. That's all he wants. Clark knows he was wrong for getting Luthor arrested, and he regrets it. He regrets taking this father away from his child, because no father should lose their child. And I love this is just Clark trying to find another way to move forward. He wants Luthor to find a new way, because revenge isn't going to solve anything. An eye for an eye just makes the whole world blind. And I love that Clark is seeing that there's a possibility of good in Luthor. Even though Luthor had him killed, there is still some good in him. And this kind of ties back to the comics as well, because there has been good in Luthor. Luthor has been a hero at some points. I mean, he always ends up going back to being a villain, but he has been a hero. He was literally Superman for a short time in the comics. You know, there is good in him. He just needs to move past his focus and hatred for Superman and Lois Lane to find it. But then we get another flashback to Luthor, and I like what they're doing with the flashbacks in the Sam Lane episode and Clark's episode, and now this episode with Luthor, because it's just adding more to the story and kind of the situations they're in. And we see that Luthor was giving his wife any property she wanted. He didn't really care about the divorce. He just wanted his daughter. That's all he cared about. But Erica already didn't want her daughter around Lex Luthor's villainy. He might have not been going around murdering people like he was accused of. However, he still wasn't a good guy. And as we move forward in the episode, we get another person that now knows the Superman family's secret, which is the character Denise. She was one of the people who was there the night Superman was killed in front of his family, and she saw Jordan and Jonathan cry over their father. So she's just another person in Smallville who will keep their secret, but knows that they are the super family. And it's interesting how it ties into this episode later, because then we have Candace coming to visit, Jonathan's girlfriend. Jonathan has to turn around and ditch her because Lois needs him to take her to see Elizabeth. And now the thing is, Jordan could have done this. Like, he wasn't being a superhero. He didn't need to, like, stand back. He could have legitimately just taken his mom to see Elizabeth. It was just flying there. He's taking a break from being a hero, so he doesn't. And then Jordan just does a terrible job at convincing Candace why Jonathan wasn't there. Which then all ties back in later, when they do get back from seeing Elizabeth, that Jonathan tells Candace they will spend the rest of the day together, and covering saying that they helped an animal shelter, this black market animal shelter, just for him to leave again. So he's definitely not winning any points at the moment, until the very end of the episode at least, because he's not very good at covering up stories. Jordan is not very good at lying, so it doesn't help that they just weren't telling Candace the truth. Now, when they did meet Elizabeth, it was very selfish of Lois to go do this. First of all, Elizabeth is pregnant. She doesn't want anything to do with her father, and by Lois going there, it revealed to Luthor where his daughter was. I mean, it didn't matter in the end because Elizabeth did agree to go see him. But, like, Lois is here telling her that she wants Elizabeth to talk to Luthor, thinking it's the only person who can reach out to her father in order to stop him from taking out her family. Which, like I said, it's so wrong for her to do this. This woman got put in protection, got relocated, hid from her father, and you're gonna pull her into it? Like, you know what kind of person Luthor is. He could have turned around. Even though he says he wants to be in his daughter's life, he cares about her, he could have turned around and kidnapped her. You don't know what he's gonna do, and that could still happen after this week's episode. But when they do ultimately bring Elizabeth back, we do get Lois and Clark talking about Doomsday and Clark going to the fortress in order to escape him. Clark is still not 100%. He also needs to talk to his mom to kind of understand Doomsday, and then when they go to do that, they show us that Doomsday is kept dying over and over in their fight. Superman did have a couple wins under his belt versus Doomsday, except because he kept dying, and that's how Luthor made him stronger. The constant dying over and over kept making him stronger and stronger and made him more of that formidable force, which is like the comics, where Doomsday was created in a harsh environment, and he kept dying, and they would remake him, and then he'd die, and they'd remake him, and as he evolved, he would get stronger to survive these harsh elements. This is the same thing. So it's really interesting to see Clark dive into his memories, where we watch him beat Doomsday over and over, but ultimately fail, and realizing that he's losing hope, that there's no way to fight this monster because he's not at 100%. Now, I do think they did Doomsday a little bit dirty this episode. Let's talk about Elizabeth and Luthor first, because we have them finally meeting. They're in the little diner. It's kind of a nice moment. You kind of see that softer side of Luthor. He does care about his daughter. He genuinely wants to be in her life. And first thing he wants to know is why she stopped talking to him. Why did she stop writing letters? And it's all because Elizabeth hated the name Luthor. Because every time anyone saw her, they thought she was like her father, especially when they heard his name and they knew who Lex Luthor was. She stopped writing him and left everything behind so that she could move on with her life, which is completely fair. With everything that happened in her life, where she was raised, where she came from, it makes sense that she'd want to leave it behind and start anew. And the thing is, Luthor in this moment and continuously through this talk makes everything about Lois Lane. It's her fault that she lied, that he killed Vox Moxie, and that he's been killing people, which I think that's total bullshit. He's definitely killed people. He's sent monsters after people to kill them. So we know he's done shady stuff. He is just trying to manipulate his daughter in a way. He talks about how he's always showed her who he really was. And you know, when you're a 14-year-old kid with your father, you're not going to see the darker stuff in his life until you get older. So of course, that vision she once had of him is completely destroyed because he's no longer that person. He's changed. He was in prison for 17 years. Of course he's changed. And because he's Lex Luthor, the man who controls everything, it's just one thing after another that shows that Luthor is trying to get back in his daughter's life, but by lying is not going to solve anything. And we even get a flashback with young Elizabeth and how Luthor said that Elizabeth is so different from him. She's the good part of him. She was the one good thing in his life when everything else was about survival. And she was the best part of his life. It's all these things to show that Elizabeth, the one person he has left in his family, he cares deeply about. But then he keeps contradicting himself as he talks about it. It's just like so ironic because Elizabeth calls him out after, when we get out of the flashback, for not being the man that sat with her. Like all he ever wants to be is her dad again. That's all he wants. But he keeps blaming, first of all, he blames his ex-wife for keeping Elizabeth in the dark about him, and then blames Lois for sending him to prison, which Elizabeth calls him out again. It's his choices he made. He's the one that became this criminal. He might have not murdered Boss Moxie, but he still did a lot of criminal stuff. So it's just like the irony of him trying to prove that he's better when he's really not. He won't take responsibility for anything bad that he's done. And that's like a big thing with Luthor, is that he's so self-centered and focused on himself that he can't see the wrong he's ever done. He just sees the one lie that sent him away, and that's what he's focused on. That's all he cares about. Like hell, we even had Clark going to Elizabeth after Elizabeth leaves Luthor and tries to connect with her in order for her to understand that she should see her father, because Clark talks about missing his father. Even though Elizabeth calls her father a monster, even Clark trying to convince her to go back by saying that, you know, Luthor has changed once he lost his daughter. So Clark is blaming himself for Luthor going down this way darker path, but he was already going down that path. This just pushed him over the edge to become darker because he got everything taken away from him. And that's when we have Elizabeth listen to Clark going back to see Luthor. And Luthor trying to talk to her about breaking the cycle of how his family was. And we learn in this moment that he came from an abusive family. He came from a family where his father left, and then his mother took out her anger on him, which ties back in the beginning of the episode where his ex-wife talked about how his mother hurt him, and then that made him not able to love anyone after that. So it's just really interesting to see the trauma that Luthor has gone through in his life, but instead of taking the steps to make a change for the better, he used all that pain and hate to make himself worse. Like, he wants to be there for his daughter. He regrets that he never was. And it's like, okay, maybe he's going to get a change of heart. Maybe he is going to be better. Even when Elizabeth was a kid, she wanted to live with her father. She cared about him. But then when we get more of them talking, because there was a lot of talking this episode, they're having a good time. Elizabeth is being open, talking about her husband and his family. She's having a boy. Like, it's a good moment until she finds out why he's living in Smallville. And it's all true that he's going after Lois to destroy her family. He thinks there has to be a price for that. He has to go after Lois because Lois needs to pay for something for him losing 17 years of his life. And I like that Elizabeth gave him an ultimatum. It's either he chooses his daughter or he chooses revenge. But of course, Luthor is so focused on revenge that Elizabeth tells him to stay out of her life. And that's the thing. He could have what he wants. He could. He might have lost those 17 years. He might have lost it all. But he could legitimately had his daughter back in his life. He could have fixed everything, been a grandfather, been part of something, moved away from Metropolis, moved away from Superman, and started something new. But instead of doing that, he is so focused on being wronged that he is ruining his life even more. So it shows you how selfish he is, how self-centered he is, and it's why he's not going to become any good. And they even show us with Luthor leaving his daughter at school in a flashback that Superman comes to get him, and Superman let him have one last moment with his daughter before taking him away. He talked to the police in order to allow him to do that because he wanted Luthor to not just ditch his daughter out of nowhere. He wanted to give him a nice send-off. So it's like Clark being a good guy, helping this father out in a way, his worst enemy, but Luthor still hating him for everything. Yeah, they were wrong about Boss Moxie, but he's still a criminal nonetheless. So I think one thing we could take away from all this is that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and taking revenge on someone after 17 years just makes everything worse and doesn't fix anything. But Luthor's storyline was very good in this episode. Like, that was a really good moment to give us between him and Elizabeth, finding out more about his daughter, finding out more about his backstory, and I like what they did. It was very, very good, and it gave us it started to give us a little bit more empathy towards this character, but then the empathy kind of went away when he just couldn't let go of all that hate and all that revenge that he wants. But let's talk about the other things that happened this episode, because we go back into Jonathan lying to Candace about the puppy story and how there's a black market. He's just continuing to lie to her, and of course she knows he's lying to her. And it's like so bad because you want to say something about it, but then he has to leave again because he hears his mom using Sam's ELT device, the device that calls Superman, which is her using it to call Doomsday, which in that moment, she's working on trying to connect with the Bizarro Superman, the man inside the monster, remembering Bizarro Lois, like trying to reach out to that softer side of him. Then we go back to Jordan covering for Jonathan with her by telling her about the family secret. At least that's how it seems like it is. It could have happened. They haven't fully confirmed if it has happened, so it could have been a lie that Jordan made up to say about their secret in their family, but it wasn't actually them being Superman, it was something else. So we still have to learn about what Candace was exactly told, but honestly, if half of Smallville knows that there's Superman and Superboys, Candace might as well know. Especially with all the stuff that Jonathan has done for her over the last few seasons, and how the Kent family has been there for her as well. So I guess we'll have to wait till next week to see. But then at the end of the episode, we learned that Lois was successful in reaching into Doomsday, getting the Bizarro Superman to come back out. Lois knew that this was the heart they had to reach into, not Luthor. Luthor was never reachable, but Bizarro was. And I like that because it shows that he remembers the hero he once was, even though this is not the typical Doomsday from the comics, where Doomsday was its own creature. It wasn't a Bizarro Superman turned into this creature. It makes sense that because he's part Bizarro, that they're able to reach out to the human side of him. They're able to reach out into him and get to his heart. Because if he was just a mindless monster, that wouldn't be the case, and he would have destroyed everything by now. And I like that she was able to remind Bizarro of his wife and family, and convincing him not to hurt her family, because it's not going to bring them back. Really touching moment with her speaking to this monster, but this is where I think this was like a cop-out. They wanted to get over and done with the Doomsday stuff fairly quickly, because it's the last season. It feels like the season's like, they're definitely trying to blow through some of the storylines. Because it's shorter, they can't complete the story. They have to find compromises. I blame the network for this. It's not the showrunner's fault. It's not the people working on its fault. It's definitely the network. And then Warner Brothers not wanting to have another DC show on while we have Superman Legacy coming out. But it was a nice moment to see Lois reaching into this monster, seeing that they're still good in him. Now the question is, where did Doomsday go after this? Did he fly off? Is there something else going on here? Because he's not back at the base with Luthor, so he's somewhere else. But now this is definitely going to send Luthor over the deep end, because he's going to want to take out Superman. That means we're most likely going to get Luthor wearing his comic kryptonite suit, where we have him in his green power suit going after Superman, because now he doesn't have a giant monster to do it. Superman is weakened, and he can go toe-to-toe with the Man of Steel. So there's a bunch of things to come from it, and I think it's going to be really cool to see what they do with the rest of the season, as we've now pushed away from the giant Doomsday monster. Because now it's just Superman versus Lex, and I think that's something we're all down for. I think we also were all hoping that we'd see a Doomsday versus the Superman family showdown. Doesn't look like that's going to happen now, so it's going to be definitely a big change of pace for when the episode comes. Now, before we get into the Superboy concept stuff, let me know, what did you think of this episode? What did you think of the way they handled Doomsday and Lex Luthor? And are there any other Easter eggs or references you noticed? Now we're going to get into that concept art, so if you don't want to see it yet and want to wait till the episode where we do eventually get suits for the boys, here's your moment to click off the video. So it came out today from a book that talks about Superman and Lois with some concept art for Jordan and Jonathan getting suits. Now, since this concept art was released, there's a good chance some of it might not actually happen in the season, and we might get different variations of the suits, because why else would you let out a big spoiler that you didn't want to let out sooner? Now, these suits might not actually end up being their final suits for the show, because it is a concept. And my other thought is, why would you release these before even revealing it in the show? It feels like a waste of potential and a big surprise, so that's why I think something else is going to be happening. Now, one of the cool things is that Jordan's suit is like the New 52 Connor Kent suit. Now, this suit didn't last very long in the comics. Once New 52 was over and that Connor Kent was gone, it went back to the OG 90s Connor Kent suit, where Jonathan now looks like that. It doesn't have the leather jacket, but the color scheme for the top half and the bottom half and the boots all look like that Connor Kent classic 90s suit. I do like how they both are wearing a Connor Kent suit, because he's had some cool suits in the comics, and obviously Jonathan Kent didn't come around until recent years, so his suit is still more newer, and of course they're going to dive deeper into the older ones, which I think is awesome. I did like the New 52 Superboy suit. It looked cool. I did like it, so I like that Jordan's concept was that one, and that Jonathan's suit is more of that classic 90s one. I did have a feeling that Jonathan might have gotten that suit, because we've been talking about it for the last season, and his inverse one had a variation of that suit as well, so it's cool to see that a lot of our theories were correct. I mean, there's still so much to come up from the show. There's still 5 episodes left. We got a half a season to go, and I'm just not ready for this show to end. There's going to be some pretty cool moments coming up. It's going to be great. Let me know, what do you think about the concept design? Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot, and you get to stay up to date with all my Superman and Lois videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next week.